Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Noonoo. I'm the K-12 editor here at EdSurge. And EdSurge is a news and information resource that's helping you bring the best in education technology through our news stories, research programs, and community activities, which include live conferences and events such as this webinar. And just for a note, at the end of last year, EdSurge joined ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. And ISTE is a nonprofit organization that serves educators interested in the use of technology and education. Thank you again so much for being here on short notice. I know you guys must have a lot of questions, so we're going to get started pretty soon. For today's webinar, we've lined up a really great group of thought leaders for a conversation on the impact of coronavirus on K-12 education. A quick note before we begin, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you via email after the live event. So if you signed up for the webinar, you'll also receive updates about recurring webinars on this topic, and we do plan to host them weekly. So you can ask questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll bring your questions into the discussion as we're able. We're going to have a lot of questions, so I'm not really sure how many we're going to get to, but we'll talk about that in a second. We also encourage you to use the chat feature to say hello and share resources, but please do put those questions for the panel into the Q&A. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to a new guide from EdSurge and ISTE. It's called Navigating Uncertain Times, How Schools Can Cope with Coronavirus, and it collects all of our stories, our contributors, and some really helpful resources. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at it. The URL is readiness.edsurge.com. I've been working on it all week, and I just think it's a really fantastic resource. So I'd like to take a second to introduce the panelists on today's call. We have Diana Neebe, who's the Director of Teacher Development at Sacred Heart Preparatory in Atherton, California. We have Reshan Richards, the Director of Studies at New Canaan Country School in Connecticut, co-founder of Explain Everything, and a board member of Global Online Academy. And Melissa Dodd, the Chief Technology Officer of San Francisco Unified School District, will be joining us. I think she might be here, but she also has a meeting. Her school is obviously dealing with this as well. Her district is dealing with this as well. So I have a few quick questions, and then we're going to move into taking some of your submitted questions. Remember, we're not going to be able to answer everything, but I will be bringing on some new speakers next week to address different topics. So if you have different topics, we will be taking a look at those questions, and we're also going to be working on a frequently asked questions article for EdSurge. So I would just stay tuned. Reshan will be answering questions today about communications policies and social emotional well-being, and Melissa probably about technology and districts, and Diana is going to be talking about digital learning plans and professional development. So if you have questions in those areas, feel free to submit them. We may get them today. First, it's the elephant in the room. It's the question that everybody kind of seemed to ask. Almost a third of you asked that when we solicited questions before the webinar. What happens when not every student has access to the internet? And I don't know that we're going to have a perfect answer for you, but we will certainly try. Reshan, I know that you had some thoughts about that, and Diana as well.
Sure. So I'm happy to start. I'm very happy and honored to be here. I think if your school is asking that question about connectivity at home, there's an assumption that we hope you've already addressed all other dimensions about what schools provide for students, whether it's food, safety, supervision, and all of those things. So as you're planning out and you're asking those questions of connectivity, my first bit of counsel is that your institution is clear that it's addressed all of those other things for its community members first. But now let's assume that you're at that point where the planning for that is in place. Another thing that I would recommend is to give your schools permission to phase out their school is not accessible strategy. What that means is the first 2 weeks of when school is closed doesn't have to look like the next 2 weeks, doesn't look like, hopefully not, the 2 weeks after that. So in your first 2 weeks, if you're planning a lot more disconnected, non-online, offline, asynchronous, self-paced, do-at-home types of things, that's okay. That's what you plan on. And then your school and leadership can focus on, if we want to extend learning using any kind of online platforms, how do we make sure that we are creating the conditions that everybody has access to it? So the focus then could be on, what could we do for connectivity? What resources locally, regionally, nationally are making themselves available, whether it's hardware or it's connection or whatever. Build yourself time to plan that. Don't think you have to go from zero to fully online, high-tech digital remote school just because an announcement is made. This idea of phasing is incredibly important. It's really hard, but it also gives you time to adjust as the conditions change. If you go from zero to a fully blown scenario without really knowing the endpoint of it, it's really hard to plan. So you want to create a back-end structure so it gives you the flexibility and agility to adjust as the conditions and the needs change. It's unprecedented territory.
Yeah, so it's a question of priorities.
Absolutely. And priorities, well-defined audiences, and really being clear on how you're going to communicate to those audiences, especially if a lot of the communication used to take place when people showed up in the building. I mean, even simple things like seeing somebody's face or walking by this room or just being a physical presence, that is a dimension that gets removed when the physical building is no longer accessible. And it's very important to think about all the different ways that either implicitly or explicitly communication happens. And like you said, prioritizing what types of communications should go out first. Focusing on the teaching and learning, that's assuming so many other conditions have been set and thought through.
Yeah, that's great. Diana?
I just add in, there's some great ideas coming out of Washington State where they're looking at, what happens when the public school is the provider of essential services to families. So setting up meal drop-offs for students with free or reduced federal lunch, looking at temporary hotspots for the community. I just read this morning that Comcast is offering free broadband to low-income families through internetessentials.com. But I'd like to echo what Reshan's saying, just thinking back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we haven't met the basic needs of our students and families, that's where we start, and that it is a real privilege to start thinking about designing for an online experience, assuming that our students have access to that education.
Yeah, that's great. So Diana, just to continue, you helped create a really well-regarded, well-shared digital learning plan. I'm going to ask you to just talk a little bit about that digital learning plan, what one of those are, and why, schools might, why they need to be thinking about this.
Absolutely. So my colleague, Joy Lopez, who's on Twitter at TechnoMaven, she and I drafted our flexible plan for instructional continuity, which is available for anybody who wants to use it as a resource or use it in whole. tinyurl.com/instructional continuity. It's Creative Commons license. We welcome you to use it. We were trying to think about sort of different levels of response from the school. So we looked at, in the very beginning, we were going to have some students with maybe immunocompromised students, for example, or whose family members were immunocompromised, who would be away from school for an extended period of time, but that it wasn't going to be the majority of our students or even a significant population. So we needed to have a flexible model that would allow us to bring those students into class as best we could and support them in learning from home. Then sort of the second level of our plan was looking at what happens when a significant portion of our population has prolonged absences. So thinking about sort of that quarantine model of if a student is out for 2 or 3 weeks, how do we help them to keep up with their studies, assuming that they're well enough to attend to their work from home? Of course, our first priority is making sure that our students are taking care of themselves. And also thinking about our colleagues who might need to be working from home for a period of time. So that was sort of our second phase. And then the third phase was if we have to flip the switch and have everybody teaching and learning online. Now we escalated, we're in the San Francisco Bay Area, we escalated quite quickly from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 schools actually closed today, and we start online education on Monday. So thinking about it in terms of sort of a flexible plan to offer instructional continuity for students and for teachers so that we can ramp up and ideally soon, hopefully, be able to ramp back down and bring folks back on campus as we're able to. I think that allows us to respond to the situation with the flexibility that we need.
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you take a second to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what San Francisco Unified is working on?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Dodd. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for San Francisco Unified. We have about 131 schools throughout the city, about 56,000 students. As you may know, for those of you who are in the Bay Area, we announced yesterday that effective Monday, we will be recessing and closing schools for the next 3 weeks. And that is inclusive of our spring break week. And so we have been in deep planning mode and to prepare for this. Today's the last day that our students will be in school. And I appreciate what was shared before, with serving such a large, diverse community, equity is at our foundation. And we know that while some of our families have access to technology and internet at home, not all do. And so we need to ensure that we have equitable access to learning during this time. And so our guidance to schools has been around non-digital as our primary focus, with digital as being a case-by-case optional basis depending on the conditions that are in place at the school. We do have a couple of our schools, our middle schools, that do have one-to-one take-home programs with internet access. That's through the Digital Promise, Verizon Innovative Learning Schools. So we're working with those schools a little differently than other schools. So we're really personalizing it for each individual school and thinking about what's appropriate also by grade span. So K-5 versus 6-8 versus high school. Our schools, so we came out very publicly in saying, we are not looking at a district-wide online distance learning model because of all of the conditions and factors that need to be considered. And to the point also raised earlier, right, our primary focus is the health and safety of our students and families. And so that's our first focus. And we will be working with schools and school communities throughout this time to ensure that continuity of learning, that there are opportunities in place for our students.
Yeah, that's great. So what might an offline strategy look like for some schools?
Yeah, so we're working on that now. So it's in progress. What we recommended to school leaders for today, since they did have, they have students in school, that they send school students home with materials, books, reading resources, books from the classroom library, books from their school library, so that there's reading taking place. Teachers, I know, and schools have been working on instructional packets, so looking at where they are in the scope and sequence of content areas or classes and pulling together resources as well. We've also had, and we've partnered up with our curriculum and instruction division to develop, and these are more teacher-facing supports and resources for teachers, organized by grade level and content area, so that they have lesson recommendations, lesson arcs and frames that they can take and adapt. Those are, I believe they're publicly available now on our website at sfusd.edu/continuous learning. And then for our schools that do have one-to-one or can guarantee both technology and internet access at home, we do have a guide for them around preparing for digital distance learning. I'm using the tools and platforms that we have in the district. We have looked at that's the Sacred Heart Guide, phenomenal job in pulling that together. So thank you. And we're providing that and other resources to our schools as well, both what we've developed and what's out there, because there are a lot of great resources that have been developed in a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Reshan, I had a quick question for you about how do you use these first few weeks off to get into a routine, and how can school leadership really convey this new routine to parents and students through regular updates?
So one of the most important things, especially in initial communications, is to give a clear sense of when to expect the next communication. So whatever even high level timeline that you can stick to, that doesn't necessarily mean new decisions are being made. But when you don't have these regular physical movement touch points, people kind of, when everything else around them is also uncertain, people really want to have a sense of like, well, this is what I can expect the next official communication with my next steps of guidance. So I would say you plan out at a high level what that looks like. And then down at like the micro level, especially once you're starting to get into 1-2 weeks of closure, I think it's helpful for families to know, well, what type of routine were their kids doing Monday through Friday, right? This doesn't mean you try to replicate the school schedule, but like recognize, hey, they're used to at 8:30 being around a bunch of other 7-year-olds, right? So that is something that has now been subtracted. Now you're probably not going to get a group of random 7-year-olds all together, but like recognize that they're used to a certain rhythm and cadence to the day, whether when it's lunches, when you're playing a game, when there are other things happening, that you just have to be like very aware of that. One thing you might do, or school could do, is suggest, well, what are types of things that we do at school? And hey, parents, here's something that you can do at home. So it doesn't require anything technical, even if it's a simple, hey, maybe you play a card game and then you make sure you like read a book. Here are some types of experiences, not because it's going to accelerate their learning or promote their academic excellence, but really because your children will feel safety and comfort in that familiarity and routine, and that's the priority. If you think about this period that we're in, where schools are closing, well, we of course hope this isn't indefinite, right? We're bridging between a time. School is closed, school is reopening. And it's what we're doing in between that's so important, because we're really preparing for this time when we're all back together. We're not necessarily trying to substitute the full experience, but recognize in that this ambiguous period where actually that endpoint might be moving, what we can do best is help students feel that sense of safety, that sense of connection and familiarity, and schools can educate families who are going to be the primary caregivers in many cases, or whomever the primary caregivers are, of what that is to best serve the students' needs.
Yeah, that's great. Diana, any thoughts about routine?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Reshan is saying, and also make sure that we're thinking about our high school students as well. I know when we think about routine and children, we often, like, our minds automatically go to the younger set. And I just want to highlight for our high school students too, they are so used to this very social environment. And like, I'm thinking about our seniors in particular, who had imagined what the end of their high school experience was going to look like. And now they're ending senior year in a pandemic, which is not what anyone had expected. I was struck by some of the lessons learned that was shared by colleagues at the Concordia International School in Shanghai. They talked about the difference between synchronous learning and asynchronous learning for their school, that synchronous was about community and maintaining relationships, whereas asynchronous was where the deep learning happened. And I know at our school, we're a very relational, small, independent school. We're looking at those Zoom experiences with our classes as an opportunity to foster relationships so that students don't feel isolated, so that there is that sense of connection and a sense of predictability. So even though the school day looks dramatically different from what it had looked like heretofore, they still know what to expect. They know that they'll be able to contact and be in touch with their teachers, and that they'll see the faces of the people that they've been spending so many hours a day with over the years.
Yeah, that's great. So just a quick follow-up question. What's something that everyone really has to do when they're drafting their digital learning plan? And also, what's one thing that you can probably leave off or maybe not go into that much detail about, Diana?
So when thinking about the digital learning plan itself, like big picture wise, I'm thinking like, what is essential? How can we pare down and cut out anything that is not essential? At the teacher level, I've been talking with colleagues all day for the last few days about like, what am I actually going to translate online? What am I going to keep? And, you know, what we're talking about is lesson planning 101. What are the things that you know students absolutely have to be able to know and do by the time that they get out of your class? And what is essential in planning to get them there? And if it's not on that list, cut it. Also thinking about the social emotional well-being of the child. So what are the ways that we can foster points of connection? From the big perspective planning, the devil's in the details. Anybody who's been sort of on our plan will have seen it iterate a lot over the last few days. We've got so many great questions about what exactly constitutes present for an online class. What if we're completely asynchronous? Then how do I tell the school that a student is showing up? And what if a kid's falling through the cracks? So I would encourage schools to think really carefully about sort of the basics that we always consider as a whole institution: attendance, participation, getting kids into class, what they need to know and do, and then how that translates to the individual teachers, and maybe setting some boundaries. So in our case, we're asking teachers to have 2 assignments a week that they're spread out over the week so that they can sort of get a check-in and get a sense that students are following through. Our counseling team is going to be sending out weekly emails to ask, are there any kids for whom you're very concerned for their social emotional state, or anybody who's falling through the cracks or falling behind in their work? So we're trying to catch kids in the ways that we would normally do, just sort of in the halls. In terms of things to leave off, again, I would say non-essentials. I would leave off anything that's going to add stress right now. High stakes assessments, anything that puts students in sort of moral quandary. So giving a traditional assessment online where you're telling them that it's going into the grade book for how correct it is, and please don't cheat, but also you're online and I can't tell what you're doing. That puts students in a really precarious position. So we shouldn't be putting our students in those situations. That would be my opinion.
Yeah, that's great. So I see some people have some questions about online tools, and I do want to get to that in a second. But first, I wanted to ask you, Melissa, about what parent communications looks like at San Francisco Unified and how you're kind of structuring talking to parents about this.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we have a phenomenal communications office here in the district, and they're the primary sort of for district-wide communications. So we've been working hard to provide sort of continuous updates that are clear and concise and chunked up, because there's a lot happening and things are evolving and moving quickly. So to keep families informed, real clear, concise communications. We use a number of different mechanisms to get the message out to families, both in terms of email, phone call, text, and leveraging all of our social media and our district website at sfusd.edu. We have been working hard to ensure that we have the most up-to-date contact information for families. That can be challenging when cell phone numbers change or an email might change. So that's been part of our messaging as well, that schools, to the best that they can, make sure that, you know, if they have their paper emergency card, that information is getting entered into our system, and also our family portal, that families are activated, have their accounts activated on our family portal, because they can update their contact information through there as well. And then that integrates and feeds into all of our communication channels. And then also schools. I mean, schools are the, you know, they have the relationships and the systems in place to communicate with their families, and so that they are in regular communication with their families as well as things unfold. Prior to what will happen tomorrow, right, we did have some school closures, and so messaging is also targeted and customized based on the situation at a particular school versus district-wide.
Yeah. Is the media kind of like a last resort for you?
That's a great question. That's probably more for our communications office. I don't think the media, I wouldn't say it's a last resort. I know they're in constant contact with the media. We do use that as a channel to be able to share information and share news. I mean, a great example that I would share is we had a school closure, one of our elementary schools, we needed to close, and we did not get the message out until about 10, maybe about 10 o'clock at night, just in terms of when we learned and how things were unfolding. We had staff and school leadership at the school the next morning in case families didn't get the message and students arrived at school. And I think only one or maybe two students came to school. So with several hundred students, I mean, that's indicative to me that our channels are working. But we wanted to make sure we were there to support families if needed.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to talk a little bit about online tools that are proving helpful in this switch to digital should a district or a school decide to go in that direction. Reshan, Diana, do you have any tips for selecting online tools, and also any advice on whether this is the best time to be using something new or whether you should just be sticking with things that you've already been using for a while?
Sure. Diana, I'll share something first and then hand over to you. So my recommendation, if this is anybody's first foray into lead or teach in this kind of setting, is use something as simple as a mobile device's camera, and recognize that your voice and your face, whether you're a school leader communicating to your staff, whether you're a teacher communicating to your students, like that is one thing that can be used to help keep that continuity. And the simple thing of being able to record a video, which is possible, and to be able to send it or upload it and send a link to a file, so it doesn't even have to be like a live stream like we're doing right now in this setting. That simple act is one way just to bring something that was familiar when the student goes to school. Now they're no longer in school, but look, hey, here's that same caring adult, or if I'm an employee and my supervisor or principal or superintendent, hey, here's that person whose voice and face I'm used to hearing. It's such a simple thing, and it starts to set a foundation of like, wow, this is really just about communicating, and it's really about that the constraints by which we're communicating have changed, but emerging tools have allowed certain type of human interactions to happen in a different way, not in the same way, that can make being separated not have to feel like isolation. And I think that's important. And then from there, you start to bridge up, right? You start to see that because of the power of voice and video, you start thinking about, well, how could I do this in real time? How could I use a Zoom or a Google Meet in order to create an option where maybe I'm going to have a call with parents or with students, and it doesn't have to be like instruction, like a lecture, just a touch point. Hey, how's it going? Right? And again, trying to recognize those important in-between moments of the school day that are actually quite an important part of the school day. Diana?
So I would add to that a shout out to all of the tech companies that are stepping up and offering free resources to schools. In terms of technology that is readily available to folks right now, I know Google Meet just opened up their platform to schools that are closing. TechSmith, Kahoot Premium, Edpuzzle Pro. There's a bunch that are trying to offer resources and support to teachers. But Stephen, to your question of is now the time to start testing out new tools, I think it really depends on the individual teacher. And so what I would propose is to have a model of high autonomy and high support, where everybody has sort of the baseline expectation. For us, we've been using Schoology as our learning management system for 6 or 7 years. And so teachers are really comfortable with that platform. And so we are layering on top of Schoology. We also are super comfortable with the Google Suite. So we built everything in our guide around those two tools. And the one new thing that we layered on was Zoom. And we actually had jumped onto Zoom before Google made the announcement that they were opening up Google Meet. So there's, I think we could have gone either way. But just to give folks something that they're really comfortable with. And we've told our colleagues, if you want to run a fully asynchronous class with Schoology and Drive, knock yourselves out. If you are a teacher who's like, I want to do Flipgrid with my class, and I'm going to screencast, and I'm going to do live Hangouts, great. You can do that too, but everybody can meet the baseline, and then we can layer on top of that. I'd also just add one other thing. Teachers are like incredibly creative beings, and also just by nature, we love to help other people. And so what we did is we set up a survey sort of at the beginning of when we were moving into like phase 2 of our move online. And we asked folks what their comfort level was with each of the tools and with steps within those tools. So not just how comfortable are you with Google, but can you set up a form and understand the results? Can you, in Schoology, do you know how to individually assign quizzes, for example, or individually assign work? And with each of those questions, we asked folks, I need help. I can figure it out with online tutorials. I've done this before and can do it independently, or I can teach and help others. And then we aggregated the list of people who said they could teach and help others and published our spreadsheet for the school. So now we have lots of leaders who are able to step into this space and not just have everybody lining up at the virtual tech office to work with our tech staff alone.
Yeah. Related point to Melissa, any advice for kind of whitelisting new tools and kind of moving in the direction of selecting new things?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're recommending, keeping it basic and simple and using the tools that we have at our disposal. Google Classroom, for example, the adoption rate for our teachers has been relatively high prior to this, so that we're recommending, sticking with our core suite. In terms of green lighting or recommending new tools, we do need to be mindful of student data privacy and ensuring that we have data sharing agreements in place. So we're looking at what tools do we already have agreements with that we could leverage if we needed to expand access. And some of those are the tools that our companies are offering, free licenses for a period of time. And then looking at leveraging, and I'll butcher the acronym for it, but like there are some state level data sharing agreements that are in place. So seeing if we could use that as well. At this point in time though, there's a lot happening. I appreciated the comment about it being it could be sort of an individualized choice, but we don't want to overwhelm and to introduce something new, given all that's at play. Our recommendation is going with our core suite of tools.
Yeah, that's great. Diana, somebody asked for a quick definition of asynchronous versus synchronous learning.
Absolutely. So I posted it in the chat for anybody to be able to see, but asynchronous, we're looking at classes where the interaction is happening without real-time interaction. So students are engaging in class materials and completing the work at their own pace, usually within some sort of given time frame. So need you to post your first post to the discussion board by Wednesday, respond to 2 classmates by Friday. That would be an example of asynchronous. Synchronous would be where classes are happening in real time at the same time. This could look like a live stream, a Zoom, a Google Meet. It could also mean a teacher working with a student in a Google Doc in chat. So that would be, an example of real-time correspondence between the teacher and the student, or student to student. Our students are so adept with FaceTime, for example, that we're talking about having some of our assignments might look like, here's your small group. You need to set up a FaceTime with this group, and these are your prompts for discussion. So we don't always have to be the grand puppeteer masterminding the way that students are talking with one another. Hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Reshan, I just wanted to circle back with you. At the beginning of this talk, you had spoken a little bit about, making sure students are physically cared for. What about their mental well-being at a time like this?
Yeah, it's another thing that, the organization has to pay attention to and make sure doesn't slip through the cracks while you're figuring out how to advance literacy and math and science and all those other disciplines. School provides so many other dimensions and services to the bringing up of children, including that wellness or mental health support. So you have to figure out and communicate clearly what those channels are. But the challenge is that sometimes it depends on the students or their families being proximate, being within the area to be able to catch or notice, or just even having those touch points, right? Because you see each other across the hallway or cafeteria, that becomes this kind of quick second check-in, and all of a sudden you lose that, right? So when especially when counselors and psychologists have big caseloads, sometimes a lot of those, like that general like upkeep and checking in just happens from like being present and being physically present. So you have to figure out what are the kind of reactive or like inbound channels that people know how to access when they need it and quickly. And I would say this is for children, and this is also going to probably be for adults too. I mean, this is a stressful time for teachers, right? Because everybody's, and anyone, I mean, just all human beings, I guess, to try to think about this. So how as a school can you provide those resources? But then you do have to get creative, and I don't have the solution, right? Because I think every institution is set up differently. But what I think is important is to have that commitment to say, you know what, we do have to figure out how we're not going to let this separation, this distancing period, make it more easy for a student or a student and their family to all of a sudden have these unmet mental health needs. So I again, it might be then figuring out what are these close networks or clusters of people around a child or a family that more proactive check-ins are happening. And maybe from a sense of prioritization, if the school has a high percentage of students or families that fit under that, maybe that is what takes priority over figuring out what video conferencing solution are we going to use for synchronous. Like, again, I can't say it enough that if your online school gets delayed by 2 weeks because you're solving the mental health question, then I think your energy is in the right place, because the long-term health of the institution, but to a degree like our society, will be better if that becomes the priority. Like, we'll figure out the math, right? We'll figure out Hamlet and the Odyssey and all of those things. Like, that'll be all right. Like, it's all of these other things that school provides that you can't diminish, and you to a degree you can't make online.
Yeah. There's probably a lot we could say about this, but I wanted to move on to teachers and how we're communicating and taking care of them as well. So Diana and Melissa, can you, I guess we'll start with you, Diana. Can we talk a little bit about teacher communications, training, and just how we're taking care of our teachers?
Absolutely. I'll just start with the mental health piece. One of the best things I think that's come out of the coronavirus disaster is hearing from colleagues around the world, and really just this upwelling of sharing and collaboration. One of the most striking examples that I heard from colleagues in China was teachers who would call another colleague on their phone and just leave the phone on and the call live, so that they had somebody else in the house to talk to if that it wasn't just them cooped up by themselves in an apartment, for example. So we've been thinking a lot about how to attend to the needs for teachers to connect with one another. So we've built into our schedule standing meetings for departments, for school leaders, for teams. So we know that people are going to collaborate on their own, but we also want to make sure that there's a dedicated check-in time for us just to sort of get together and see how we're all doing. I've been so gratified to see how wonderfully collaborative people have been during this experience. And one of the things with our colleagues that I'm noticing is people offering to do things like co-host a Zoom session. So, gosh, I've never done Zoom before. I'm really nervous about doing this for the first time. Will you be my co-pilot and monitor the chat? And so folks collaborating in really different ways where they can do that from two different places. Our school site is still going to be open, just closed to students and families. So we have some folks who are coming into campus, and another teacher will come in and be their TA and help set things up so that if they're demoing a lab in science, that they don't have to handle it all on their own. But this is one of those moments where we see just the generosity and creativity of teachers really coming to the fore, and it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Melissa, any thoughts about teachers?
I would just say for us, given our size and scale, we really do rely on our principals to be that direct conduit with teachers. And so us sharing information with principals in digestible ways for them to share easily with their educators. Again, using our online platforms, posting announcements in our, SIS and other systems where the teachers might be going and looking, our website as well, so that they're getting information. And then for us in technology, we have a team, what we call digital learning facilitators, who are teacher leaders at schools. So using that network to be able to share out information and resources. I will just hit upon the collaboration so far. People coming together has been really impressive. Teachers at school sharing resources and information, messages that they've sent out to their students or community, so that we can create sort of an online library of those. You know, we have limited time and lots of constraints, so how we can sort of adapt what somebody else has done already and use that. So really that collaboration has been really impressive, and I'm just amazed at what our teachers have been developing and preparing on their own, and their willingness to share that and help colleagues. So it's been amazing to see that as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I did have a question from the chat for Reshan. Provided that, you know, schools are able to handle the emotional well-being piece and decide to move to online learning, is this something that teachers with relatively little training can figure out and hope to do well?
Well, I would hope aspirationally that anyone who's in the education profession considers themselves a, quote, lifelong learner. So I think if you've got both, you know, your own curiosity and a commitment to the children's well-being, I think anything is possible. I think where it gets tricky is if the expectations are unclear, or if the expectations are unfair as far as what's actually possible to do. I think if you're a teacher who's pretty clear about, one, you care about the well-being of your students and serving their learning, right? You're not just doing a job, like that there's more to it. I think you create the mindset to be able to figure out, how am I going to try to make this work? I would say you will not go from zero to like amazing remote online instructor. It's just not going to happen instantly. Like, I bet you if you did a year-long program preparing teachers, you would still not have, you know, 100% of them being fully equipped to do it, right? It's all about, how do you take what you already know and do well about educating young people and figure out, all right, my constraints are different, my ways of communicating to them are different. How do I understand the affordances and limitations of those various modes? And then how do I choose which ones are going to align best with the way that I do things, right? Some people are going to are great storytellers and speakers. You know what? You're probably going to be really well set up by just creating some audio recordings for your kids to listen to. And that might be your thing. Somebody else might be a really dynamic live webinar facilitator. And you know what? That's going to be the space where they're able to do their best work. I think our responsibility as school leaders is to, one, again, be very clear and fair about expectations, and two, create the time and whatever space we can for people to increase their understanding of what choices are available to them, and then empower teachers to make good choices. So I guess, again, optimistically, I say, yes, absolutely. But so much depends on how the conditions that the leadership sets. Yeah.
So Diana, just to follow up on that one, any word about putting expectations and responsibilities in the digital learning plans themselves?
So we did that. We set baseline expectations, and the goal there, to Reshan's point, was for us to be super clear. We also didn't want to be unfair to kids. What we're learning from a lot of schools around the world is that for teachers in disciplines who are less likely to give traditional regular homework, that in a shift to online, they've tended to actually be the ones to overload students. So we tried to set some boundaries so that all of us kind of got a sense of what the baseline expectations would be. You know, we never intended to be an online school, and our students never intended to be online learners. So I think approaching this with some grace, some flexibility, and also just the understanding from school leaders that all of your teachers are working well over full-time right now. And so anything that we can do to limit what we're asking of teachers, anything that we can do to push in support to make sure that teachers know that we have their backs and that we see all of the hard work that they're doing, And then opening up spaces for teachers to share with one another so that we don't have to keep recreating. This is the exact reason why Joy and I, the second that we thought we were done, and we weren't done because we've edited it like 10 times since then, that we pushed it out as fast as we could, because we want to make sure that nobody has to do extra work on their own.
Yeah, that's great. Melissa, we had a question about whether any devices are being distributed or allocated in San Francisco, and just basically how you're handling your existing device initiatives at schools.
Sure, yeah. So we're figuring that out right now. It's a work in progress. We do know, so we've been working with our schools to determine who are some of our priority student populations. So for example, we have high school students who are dual enrolled in our city colleges here. And our city college is closed and moved online. And those students are dependent, these are credit bearing courses that they're taking. So we're working with them through our college and career office to get devices loaned out, as well as hotspots. The original plan was we were still open. The students could take, rather than going to CCSF, they could do their online classes in school. That quickly changed. So now we're working to get them access at home. And then we do know that some of our schools are loaning out devices that they have in their inventory. Again, we have not made a statement or set an expectation that learning is moving online, because we know that we don't have access for all of our students. And we also know that schools are deploying devices and loaning them out to students. So we've put together resources to help them with that. A quick checkout form so that we know what device went with whom. We put together templates actually based off of one of our schools. One of our teachers had created it, a quick question to determine who needs access, and then resources for them about how to manage those devices off campus. So it's sort of rapid response mode and trying to be as responsive as we can to our schools to help them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I want to talk a little bit, I'll start with you, Melissa. So you must have a lot of additional programs at San Francisco Unified, adult learning, extracurriculars at schools. I mean, there's a lot, there's more than just K through 12, 9 to 3. Anything in plan for that? And then we can get on to Diana and Reshan.
Mm-hmm. Right now, given where we are in terms of our plan for the next 3 weeks, we are focusing on food distribution. So how might we be able to feed families and get food to families, as well as working with our city partners and CBOs around childcare as well. So especially for our youngest children, but childcare opportunities as well. With each sort of move and shift, we've had so many different contingency plans of if this, then that at the district level. But those are some of our key priorities right now.
Yeah, Diana?
We've been thinking a lot about clubs and co-curriculars and how to make space for those in our schedule so that students still have that touchstone with the people that they spend lots of time with outside of classes. So we've built that into our schedule. We are very much like all other schools right now in the mode of cancel, reschedule, postpone. And so, I think because this is so early in the pandemic and people are scrambling to get students home and start the social distancing, I think we're really in the very beginning of this. So we'll see where it leads.
Right, us too.
Yeah, Reshan?
So one area that we haven't talked much about are kind of all of those other pieces in between at a school, right? So you've got your administrative to the whole community, and then you have your teacher to student, but then there's so many of the other offices and teams that help school run. And a lot of those folks are used to only operating in a face-to-face setting. And so you can't forget that they also need support and coaching and training and expectations of how they're expected to work and connect. So, if your institution is just being closed to students because it's not necessarily a contamination site, you might have more flexibility there. But if there's other types of things that are happening where everybody's being asked to kind of stay away, then it's easy for that to get left unconsidered. And so that's something, at least in my institution, that we are paying close attention to.
Yeah, yeah. And how are we paying attention to students that need additional support? So students that might be in special education, students with disabilities. Is this something that should be spelled out explicitly in communications or digital learning plans? Reshan, do you have any quick thoughts?
Quick thought is yes. And yes. And remember, from that kind of priorities piece, when you think about families and students in the population that rely on certain services that the school institution provides, and that those will be completely subtracted when put in a distancing situation, like that has to be the top of the list. Again, I don't know what the actual pragmatic solutions are. I think those vary based on region and institution and the terms of that. But like, that's where my focus would be, like, how are we going to make sure we're planning for that, right? So if there's a student who's depending on the school for counseling, it's there. Somebody needs it for physical support, or they always have this school supplied aid for even just general OT needs and things like that, then how is that being addressed, right? And how is the school helping to partner in order to figure out how that's done? But those things should rise to the top, way ahead of, the best online lecture capture tool.
Yeah, yeah. Diana, any thoughts about spelling out those expectations and responsibilities in this area?
So at our school, we have a population of students with learning differences and accommodations for those differences. And we've spelled out, one, just absolutely students with accommodations, those accommodations have to still be met. So if a teacher has a block of time in which to meet with students and there's a learning task that's to be finished by the end of that block of time, we've done a lot of support around how do you individually assign to students with accommodations to make sure that they have extended time if that's part of their learning plan. In terms of social emotional support, our counseling staff is going to be working every day during the school day, just like the rest of us, but scheduling one-on-ones with students primarily via Zoom, and then family meetings as well, to make sure that students who use the school for that sort of psychological and emotional support are still getting those essential services. We are not a school that serves students with profound learning differences, and so I would defer to Melissa or another colleague at a public institution that sees more of that profile of student.
Yeah, that might be something that we address in a future webinar. But I know that this isn't exactly your area, but is there any way that tech departments are working in this area, Melissa?
Right, that's mostly the sphere of our special education office. Some of the things that we have been, though, working with them on, in building out sample lessons, how are we addressing student learning needs and accommodations within the lessons, and just being a support. I mean, right now our division, right, we're both focused on technology and finding all the different ways that we can support all of our colleagues. So as our special ed team is thinking about our students with IEPs and we all of the different types of learning needs and support needs that our students have, right, are there ways that technology can support? And so we do handle that right now on a case-by-case basis, but that'll be part of all of our planning that we're going through over the next week or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask Diana, any quick thoughts about how teachers are handling assessment?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one because when we flip the switch to online, we can't really proctor our own assessments. We're focusing a lot on formative assessment, and we're making this assumption, which might be false, but hopefully isn't, that school will be back in session at some point before the year's out. So a lot of us are thinking about, if I'm going to be giving a final exam to my high schoolers, and I can do a final assessment, then a cumulative assessment that gives me a sense of their mastery of particular subject matter, then right now is a great time for us to consolidate learning, for students to be focusing on reflection, metacognition, for students to be working in groups. We've got some of our math teachers, for example, who are asking students to write practice test questions and then have one class give the practice test to the other class, and then give, you know, an annotated rubric for what the, you know, what the scoring guide would look like. And then the score for students is not how many did you get right. It's where are your strengths, where are your areas for growth, and what notes to future self do you want to write down so that when you study for the final, you're ready for it.
Yeah, that's great. Last thoughts, Reshan, before we wrap this up?
I think it's, sorry, there's a phone ringing in my background. I just think it's so important to take things step by step, week by week, give yourself permission to adjust and alter your plan. I know it's hard to like roll back or walk back communications, especially if it's come from the top down, but because the conditions are changing, the end point is unclear. I think everybody has to take a breath and say, like, this is about the kids, right? And first and foremost, and how do we help them the most? Because even nationwide or globally, you know, 2 months of children ages 3 to 18, or include college, that would be kind of having their core needs unmet because of all of this stuff, like that's bad for everybody, right? So I think just constantly being flexible and okay with needing to revise and adjust as new information presents itself is really, really important.
Yeah, no, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much to everybody, Melissa Dodd, Diana Neebe, Reshan Richards. We really appreciate your time. We have, you know, our Twitter handles are there. Again, I'm Stephen Noonoo. I'm the K-12 editor here at EdSurge. We provide the latest resources and news about how technology is shaping the ways we learn and teach. You can sign up for our free newsletters or find out more resources at edsurge.com. Again, that guide is readiness.edsurge.com. I encourage you all to take a look at it. We'll be collecting your questions and we'll be trying to get to as many of them as we can next week in the webinar, which will be happening same time, same place. And we'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording next week and some additional resources that were talked about today. To check out more of our webinars, you can go to edsurge.com/e/webinars. Thank you so much to everybody, and we'll see you next week. Have a great afternoon.